The hours seemed to pass slowly, as my grandpa and I reconciled that we may never see my friend Adam again. We searched the area where the giant dino bird made off with Adam, but we couldn't get to the other side of the big ravine where we figured the bird took him. Tears were stained and dried on my cheeks as we sat motionless and quiet for hours in shock. Finally, my grandpa looked at me, speaking in a very stern tone. "Boy, get out your sleeping bag and try to get some sleep. We will need all the rest we can muster before we go searching again." I complied, not saying a word, and tried to think positive. I closed my eyes and tried to rest, but sleep was dangerous here, and we both knew it. Tucked away near a small cave, we found a bed of leaves to rest our weary eyes. Eyes that had seen far too much in those last few hours. The cave walls were shallow, but provided enough cover to keep us dry in case it rained. Fears inside me began to play over and over in my mind as I lied there. I heard the hooting of an owl mingled with the blowing leaves in the forest. If I had to be honest, it was a peaceful, serene setting, but the fears of finding Adam mangled among those beautiful fall leaves was enough to keep me from fully relaxing. My grandpa was now snoring in unison with the wind, talking in his sleep as the haze of the moonlight crept in between the shadows of the half-barren trees. Then, as if every bone in my body found the chill from the cool night air, I stiffened suddenly. There was a sound coming from the hill just beyond the cave we were sleeping in. I heard it then. There was a flapping of large wings above me. Ducking under a small tree branch, I heard it scream as it appeared to hold something, and then slowly lay it down in the woods. I heard a scream and squawking. I sat up and unzipped my sleeping bag. It was sobbing that was barely able to be heard, but I knew the sound. I tried to nudge my grandpa, but he was out cold. The stresses mixed with his old age kept him a prisoner, locked inside his own body. I stood up, grabbing my gun, and walked slowly from around the cave and made my way up the small hill. There was something there I couldn't make out, that seemed to thrash around in pain. It was attempting to move in the direction of where I was. Leaves crunched beneath my feet as I realized that the bloody mess thrashing around was my friend. It was Adam. I kept thinking, how will I get to him with that giant bird holding him down? The bird's eyes were black like coal, and it moved in my direction as I attempted to get close to Adam. It was big, but not as big as I had thought. That is when I saw something strange. Directly behind the big bird was another, and then another much larger bird. This was the baby then? The larger of the three birds flapped its large wings, causing a breeze to blow in our direction. That is when the smaller bird flew up into the sky, and the three of them caused quite a stirring of wind that made me fearful I'd lose my grandpa. There was such a gust of wind that it blew leaves all over, and the dirt, tree branches, sticks, and stones swirled all around. The wind settled, and that is when I took my opportunity to move toward Adam. The darkness was overshadowed by the light of the moon peeking through the trees. The moon seemed alive. Through a clearing in the canopy of trees, it provided good lighting. I called for my grandpa, and as I put my hand upon him, he looked up at me. A piece of wood was injected inside his left upper eyelid. I wish I had not looked at his eye. I wanted to vomit staring at it. "Adam, can you hear me? Get me the hell out of here, Ralphie, please." He tugged at me with his arm. The other lay behind him, and when I attempted to move him, he screamed. "Can you feel your legs?" I asked him, panicking. "Broken," he whispered, choking through painful coughing. I heard something behind me, and I looked down the hill. It was my grandpa. Thank God for small miracles. "I found him!" My grandpa ran to us instantly. "Boy, can you stand or walk?" asked my gramps frantically. "His bones are broken. We need to get him out of here." My grandpa was quick on his feet, and he ran back to his bag and pulled out a part of the tent we had originally decided we didn't need. Breaking the pieces into multiple angles, he made a makeshift gurney. It wasn't the greatest of quick inventions, but it gave us the ability to move Adam to the safety of the cave. Once inside, my grandpa had Adam sip on some water and gave him Tylenol for the pain. It wasn't much in the way of medical treatment, but anything was better than nothing. Once he was finished with that, he reached inside the first aid kit and grabbed some tweezers to try and remove the wood from his eye. My grandpa had been in the Vietnam War, so he had experience in first aid. He even told me stories of how he used to help out with the surgeries in the middle of nowhere to save his fellow soldiers. He began by cleaning the wound, and luckily the giant piece of splinter was only in the skin portion of his eyelid, and easy to remove. Adam slipped into a deep feverish sleep as we tried to make him more comfortable. He was just finishing up cleaning the wound when we saw her. Standing just outside the cave where we had dragged Adam was a young woman wearing a black tattered dress. I couldn't get a clear visual of her, but there she was. They are here now. Get me out of here. Adam began to yell, tossing his head back and forth while his eyes remained closed. My grandpa looked up at her and stepped out of the cave, hoping perhaps she was there to help and had witnessed them dragging Adam inside, made my heart leap for joy. Can you help? Gramps asked the young woman. I patted Adam's shoulder gently and then walked out into the forest with my grandpa, holding a flashlight in my hand. Something seemed off about her. Grandpa was speechless, and I could see he appeared startled. I shined my flashlight on her to get a good look at her, and then I saw her eyes. Her eyes were pale blue, but they had blood coming from them, as if she'd been crying blood. Her skin was yellow and appeared to fall off her bones, and her hair was covered in mud and dirt. My flashlight quivered in my hands as I saw that just behind her, the roots and trees and brush began to spread themselves around the ground. Other beings just like her appeared behind one of the oak trees in the distance, and the moon did my eyes no favors, as the luminous pale moon provided a spotlight to the horrors we were about to endure. The roots crawled along the ground in front of us like snakes, and my only thoughts were, what if they get poor Adam? My fears were realized as the roots snapped past us and crawled towards my sleeping friend and wrapped around him. It snapped him out of the cave, pulling him across the ground. The beings continued to walk toward us, gagging a murky black liquid from each of their mouths as I tried to fight the roots away from Adam. To no avail, they were too strong. They dragged him along the ground, and a hole opened up and swallowed him inside. I could feel the tears stinging as I tried to stop from falling inside the hole with my friend. Gunshots rang out as my grandpa tried to hit them, but they didn't stop. They kept coming closer. Why are you doing this to us? I screamed in a mix of terror and frustration. Their heads all cocked in unison in my direction. I was probably too traumatized at this point to give a shit what happened to me. I had had enough. The same creature that first met us spoke, gargling black goo from her lips as though she were coughing up the dirt she had come from. You asked for it, she hissed. No, I yelled. Yes, your fears are the command. I didn't understand. My anger, all of my fears subsided, and I walked over to her and hit her with the back of my rifle. She fell to the ground, and to my shock and utter amazement, began to seep back into the ground as the earth swallowed her. I looked around, and all the other zombie-like creatures had also vanished. My thoughts returned back to Adam, and I tried to figure out a way to help him. I looked down, and there he was, dangling in midair by the roots, as though he were a marionette. I began to climb into the opening, using the same roots to move closer to him. That's when I saw her again. She came at me quickly, clawing towards me like a spider, and the roots were her web. There was flat earth beneath both she and Adam, so I was at least glad that the hole didn't go any deeper. I crawled up out of there, but I could see her eyes glaring at me, keeping my friend in her clutches. There was a cackling coming from her, and I could see the zombie-like beings at the bottom of the opening, walking around just a few feet away from him. Then it hit me. The last fear I had was that they'd return. When I saw Adam, it was exactly like I had feared it would be. But the bird, the one that took Adam to begin with, whose fear was that? I looked at my grandpa. He was looking at Adam and trying to cut the roots with a large machete he carried in his satchel. Grandpa, it feeds off fears. Say what, boy? Everything that's happening to us. I've thought it, or I've feared it. Didn't you once tell me about a hawk grabbing you when you were a little boy of 3 or so? He stood thinking about it. I've never forgotten how scared I was. I was just a little thing then. It carried me 10 feet into the air, and my paw had to shoot at it, and it dropped me. Just like the birds that took Adam. This is all my fault. He hung his head low. No, it's not. It's the place. I've been in these woods hundreds of times. I've never in my life seen anything like this. He began cutting at the roots again, but with each cut, another root grew in its place. Then I saw it in the distance. A stag made of bones. It walked toward us. Its size was massive. In its neck was a blade buried there, like an old wound. I looked at it and began to cry. My final fear was coming to fruition. My grandpa looked at me. Is that you? It was me. When I was 10, my grandpa had taken me on my first hunting trip. I had a clean shot. The stag was dead, but when I approached, it bucked at me. I was scared and saddened by what I had done to this beautiful animal. My grandpa told me to finish the job. Never let it suffer. He handed me a blade and showed me where to stick it. I recall crying, and yet there was a liberation I had never felt. But he had always haunted me. I knew then what I had to do. I had to face him. I walked over to the massive set of bones and pulled the blade from its neck. It had an eagle etched upon it. The wind whispered, I hear you. I knew that it was the guardian spirit of these strange woods. The stag's bones crumbled to the ground. He was no longer there. I held the knife up and went towards the creature. Her cackling continued as she rose and made her way toward me. I lifted the blade and stabbed her. When I did, she seemed to disappear into thin air. I cut the roots, and they crumbled away from Adam as my grandpa and I pulled him back to safety. The blade seemed to glow, and I knew then what I had to do. I tossed it into the ground, and it began to close up the hole in the ground along with our fears. I looked at Adam, who now seemed to be surrounded by the spirit of the great stag. It flowed around him and hovered in an almost blinding light. The color to Adam's face seemed to come back, and he seemed to be healing at a rapid speed, much to me and my grandpa's disbelief. I heard him laugh, and I knew he'd be okay. He sat up and wiggled his big ugly toes. What the hell just happened? While I felt his sentiment, all I cared about was getting back to my grandpa's cabin. It was as though we shared some telepathic event, and without saying a word, the three of us set out onto the trail back towards the cabin. Miles of great forest stretched onward, and canopies of trees covered our heads. I could no longer see the beauty in it anymore. For what seemed like hours, we made our way to the cabin, and we packed up all of our things. We left that afternoon and never returned to the old cabin ever again. We never talked about it either. Some years later, the weekend my grandpa passed away, I found an old photo from the day we set out on that trip. It was shoved in my grandpa's old diary, and what I found made me nearly topple over. Drawn on a large map inside was a drawing with names of places such as Dead End Den. It looked like he had drawn a map of the forest. It was a large maze, and the shape being the stag's head. There were trails and handmade drawings of waterfalls, drawings of giant creatures like the bird that had taken Adam. The strangest thing was the fact that my grandpa had the exact place where we buried the blade, and all around the area was a deep hole that had a drawing of fire around it. Just beneath the drawing, which was all done by hand, were the words, Etsa's door. I didn't know what it meant, but one thing was for certain. My grandpa had gone back to that place and seemed to have been searching for something ever since. I resigned to the belief it was my grandpa's issue. I was done with that place and the hells it brought with it. I was 36 years old now, with a fiancée Diana. I wanted to forget all about it. I packed away all the things I found and put them in a box in the passenger seat of my vehicle. Then it happened. I was driving along the 2-lane highway near Lake Erie when I looked towards the water. There inside the lake was the beginning of a waterspout. It came towards me, just as the map in the box began to glow, shooting a beam of light up and out of my vehicle window in the direction of the waterspout. From within the waterspout grew a creature that appeared to grow larger by the second. Green horns appeared from atop its head, and scales along its back, and one step of its foot. The water from the lake sprung out, flooding the road. Was this the Bessie I had heard so much about in local legends of cryptids? I knew then I had never really escaped that forest. It was with me in everything I did. It was trying to get me now. The water moved forth, picking up my truck and carrying me outward. I heard it whisper, "It's I closed my eyes and thought of Diana. The water washed away from me, and the creature faded from view. I looked at my grandpa's map and tossed it out my car window. It blew away in the wind, and as it did, so did all of my fears of that sacred place. The place where all my fears had learned to grow, and I had learned to let them go. I traveled along that highway, and I never looked back again.